The 1940s is basketball's forgotten decade. A 10-year period lost between the game's humble invention and its modern, glamorous ascent. Behind those grainy highlights was a sport on the brink of collapse, torn apart by money, corruption, racism, and a world at war. This wasn't the era of superstars and sneaker deals. This was the era of factory workers playing for pocket change, of games held in smoky bingo halls, of rules that changed from one town to the next. Before the NBA became a global empire, professional basketball was a fragile, grimy, and often desperate affair. It was a sport fighting for its very soul, a sport that had to survive its own darkest impulses before it could ever hope to shine. This is the story of how basketball barely survived its darkest decade, and how that chaos, against all odds, gave birth to the NBA. Today, the structure of professional basketball is simple. There is the NBA. That's it. One league, 30 teams, a clear path from college to the pros. But in the 1930s and early 1940s, there was nothing simple about it. There was no single dominant league. There was no clear authority. There was just chaos. Imagine dozens of regional circuits, corporate-sponsored teams, and traveling barnstorming squads, all crisscrossing the country, all claiming to be professionals. It was the Wild West of pro hoops. There was no national television to broadcast the games, no centralized rulebook to govern them, and often not even enough money to pay for professional referees. A local coach, or even a fan, might be pulled from the stands to officiate. The closest thing to a major league was the National Basketball League, the NBL, founded in 1937. But this was a far cry from the NBA. It was a league built by Midwest industrial giants: Goodyear, Firestone, General Electric. The teams had names like the Akron Goodyear Wingfoots, the Fort Wayne Zollner Pistons, and the Sheboygan Redskins. These weren't full-time athletes. The NBL was semi-pro at its core. Players worked punishing shifts on the factory floor by day and played grueling basketball games at night, earning a few extra dollars to supplement their wages. Then there was the American Basketball League, the ABL, on the East Coast. It was older, more established, and based in the dense urban centers of New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The ABL was grittier, played in smaller, more intimate arenas. The money was even worse than in the NBL, but the passion was just as fierce. And beyond these so-called major leagues was a whole other universe of basketball. Independent teams and barnstormers were the lifeblood of the sport. Legendary squads like the Harlem Globetrotters and the New York Renaissance, the Wrens, toured the country relentlessly, taking on all comers. They were basketball gypsies, playing multiple games a week in a different town every night, living out of buses and suitcases, all just to survive. They weren't just playing for a trophy, they were playing for their next meal. It wasn't a league, it was chaos. A patchwork of businessmen, soldiers, and part-timers, all pretending to play professional basketball. The sport was a fractured, unstable mess, a house built on sand. And a storm was coming that would threaten to wash it all away. On December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into the Second World War. Every corner of American life was transformed, and the fragile world of professional basketball was no exception. The game changed completely, almost overnight. The league rosters were decimated. Star players, bench warmers, and coaches alike traded their team jerseys for military uniforms. Men who were heroes in local gyms became soldiers, sailors, and airmen scattered across the globe. Teams scrambled for replacements, signing older veterans, teenagers fresh out of high school, or anyone who was deemed unfit for military service. The quality of play plummeted. Leagues were forced to make desperate decisions. Some shut down operations for the duration of the war. Others merged, combining their depleted rosters just to field enough players to compete. The Oshkosh All-Stars and the Chicago Bruins, two NBL powerhouses, were just a few of the teams that had to suspend play. The game on the home front withered. Crowds, once the lifeblood of these struggling leagues, shrank to almost nothing. Wartime rationing on gasoline and rubber meant that travel was severely limited. Attending a basketball game became a luxury few could afford or justify. The national focus was on the war effort, not on a minor sport struggling for attention. Basketball, already a fringe entertainment, was pushed even further into the shadows. But while the professional game was dying at home, something remarkable was happening overseas. Basketball became a vital part of military life. On dusty airfields in the Pacific, in makeshift gyms in Europe, and on the decks of aircraft carriers, soldiers played the game. It was a connection to home, a way to build camaraderie, and a release from the horrors of war. The Army and Navy formed their own elite teams, stacked with former pro and college stars. These military squads toured bases and competed in high-stakes tournaments to boost morale. They were, for a time, some of the best basketball teams in the world. And as they traveled, they introduced the sport to a global audience. The seeds of basketball's international growth were planted on the battlefields of World War II. The war almost killed professional basketball, but it also spread the game farther than ever before. When the soldiers came home in 1945, they brought their love for the game with them. But they returned to a sport that was broke, disorganized, and desperate for attention. The fight for survival on the court was about to begin all over again. The war was over and America was booming. The post-war economy roared to life, and a new era of prosperity began. But professional basketball was left behind. While the rest of the country celebrated, the sport was on life support, gasping for air. Baseball was America's undisputed king, the pastime that ruled the summer. Football was a rising giant, a brutal spectacle that owned the fall. But basketball, in the national consciousness, it was still a minor indoor sport, something to pass the time during the cold winter months. It had no national footprint, no major media coverage. It was an afterthought. The settings for these professional games were a world away from the gleaming arenas of today. Teams played in tiny high school auditoriums, dimly lit armories, and even bowling alleys. It wasn't uncommon for a game to be delayed because the floor was too slick from the dance that was held the night before. Crowds were sparse. A turnout of 500 people was considered a decent night. Many teams played in front of nearly empty stands, the silence of the gym broken only by the squeak of shoes and the shouts of the players. And the players themselves were far from wealthy superstars. Most made between $50 and $100 a game, a wage that was barely enough to live on. There were no guaranteed contracts. If you got injured, you didn't get paid. This forced almost every player to have a day job. They were firemen, policemen, teachers, and factory workers who punched a clock in the morning and put on a basketball uniform at night. The financial precarity was constant. It was common for teams to fold mid-season, leaving players stranded and unpaid when ticket sales dried up. The owners were often a shady collection of small-time businessmen looking for a quick buck. Some used their teams as tax shelters with no real interest in winning. Player loyalty was non-existent. It wasn't unheard of for a player to switch teams in the middle of a season, chasing a promise of an extra $10 per game. The entire enterprise was rife with instability, and that instability bred cynicism. Rumors of gambling and fixed outcomes spread like wildfire. With players making so little, the temptation of a gambler's bribe was ever present. The integrity of the game was constantly in question. For most players, pro basketball in the 40s wasn't a dream. It was a side hustle, and the only thing thinner than their paychecks was the league's integrity. In the 1940s, the world of professional basketball was a reflection of America itself, deeply and officially segregated. While the NBL and ABL battled for survival, they did so as all-white leagues. An unwritten but unbreakable gentleman's agreement among the owners barred black players from signing contracts. This injustice meant that many of the greatest basketball players on the planet were forbidden from competing on the sport's biggest stages. But they didn't stop playing. They formed their own teams, their own leagues, and their own barnstorming circuits, creating a vibrant and dominant basketball subculture. The two most famous of these teams were the New York Renaissance, known as the Wrens, and the Harlem Globetrotters. The New York Rens, an all-black team owned and operated by Bob Douglas, were arguably the greatest basketball team of the era, black or white. Formed in the 1920s, they hit their peak in the 30s and 40s, a dynasty of speed, skill, and cohesive team play. They were basketball pioneers, introducing a style of play built on quick passes and constant movement that was years ahead of its time. In 1939, they won the first ever World Professional Basketball Tournament, defeating the best white team, the Oshkosh All-Stars, to be crowned undisputed champions of the world. And then there were the Harlem Globetrotters. Today, they are known for their comedy routines and circus-like antics. But in the 1940s, the Globetrotters were a serious, legitimate, and utterly dominant competitive team. They traveled the country taking on all challengers, and more often than not, they won. In 1948, in a landmark game, the Globetrotters defeated the Minneapolis Lakers, the champions of the all-white NBL, led by the league's biggest star, George Mikan. The victory sent shockwaves through the basketball world. It was undeniable proof that black players weren't just good enough to compete, they were among the very best. The lives of these players were incredibly difficult. They traveled thousands of miles by bus, as most hotels and restaurants across the country refused to serve them. They often had to sleep on the bus or in the homes of gracious strangers. They faced constant racism and discrimination, yet they played with a joy and a brilliance that captivated audiences wherever they went. Figures like William "Pop" Gates, Dolly King, and Tarzan Cooper were legends in the black community. Basketball royalty who were denied their rightful place in the mainstream sports world. In the 1940s, the best basketball in the world wasn't played in the official leagues. It was played by the teams that weren't even allowed in. The exclusion of black players was a stain on the sport, but the undeniable talent of teams like the Rens and the Globetrotters slowly but surely began to break down the walls of segregation, setting the stage for Jackie Robinson's debut in baseball and, eventually, for the integration of the NBA in 1950. By 1946, professional basketball was still a mess. The NBL was a league of small, industrial Midwestern towns, and its future looked bleak. But a new, powerful group of players was about to enter the game, and they weren't athletes. They were businessmen. They were the owners of the major sports arenas in the biggest cities on the East Coast and in the Midwest. Madison Square Garden in New York, the Boston Garden, the Chicago Stadium. These men saw professional hockey packing their arenas during the winter, and they had a simple, powerful idea. Why not do the same with basketball? They saw empty nights on their calendars as wasted revenue. And so, in 1946, they formed their own league, the Basketball Association of America, or BAA. The BAA was different from the start. Its founders weren't basketball purists, they were capitalists. Their goal was simple: bring professional basketball out of the small-town gyms and into the major metropolitan arenas. The league was backed by big money and big cities, with teams like the New York Knickerbockers, the Boston Celtics, and the Philadelphia Warriors. This was the first true blueprint for the modern NBA. But the BAA had a huge problem. The product on the floor was terrible. The quality of play was rough, sloppy, and often ugly. While the NBL had the more experienced players and established teams, the BAA had to scramble to fill its rosters. The games were often low-scoring, physical affairs, characterized by constant fouling and a slow, plodding pace. The players were not yet stars, and the crowds reflected this. While games in New York and Philadelphia drew decent crowds, attendance in other BAA cities was abysmal. The league was losing money, and fast. Despite its on-court struggles, the BAA had one crucial, overwhelming advantage over the older, more established NBL: money and marketing. Because the teams were located in major media hubs, they received press coverage that the NBL teams in Fort Wayne and Sheboygan could only dream of. The arena owners were masters of promotion, using their resources and connections to create a perception of a major league, even when the reality was far different. The BAA was selling an image, big city basketball for a big city audience. They positioned themselves as the future of the sport, and slowly, the narrative began to take hold. They were losing the battle on the court, but they were winning the war for public perception. This aggressive, business-first approach would ultimately allow the upstart BAA to challenge and eventually overtake the NBL, setting the stage for a final, desperate merger that would change the sport forever. As the BAA and NBL fought for basketball supremacy, a cancer was growing within the sport, threatening to destroy it from the inside. With players earning poverty-level wages and league oversight being virtually non-existent, the game became a prime target for gamblers and criminals. Corruption ran wild. The most insidious practice was point shaving. Gamblers would approach players, offering them cash, often more than their weekly salary, to ensure their team didn't win by a certain number of points, or to shave the point spread. A player wouldn't have to throw the game entirely, which might be too obvious. He just had to miss a key free throw, commit a silly foul, or make a lazy pass at a crucial moment. It was a subtle form of cheating that was incredibly difficult to detect. This plague wasn't confined to the struggling professional leagues. It was rampant in the college game as well. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a massive point-shaving scandal centered in New York City would rock the foundations of college basketball. Star players from top programs like CCNY, Long Island University, and Kentucky were arrested for taking bribes from mob-connected gamblers. The scandal revealed a deep, systemic rot that implicated dozens of players and multiple national championship teams. The public was horrified. The revelations confirmed the worst fears about the integrity of the sport. Newspapers began calling basketball the crooked game. How could fans trust what they were seeing? Was that missed layup an honest mistake? Or was the player paid to miss it? Every close game, every questionable call, every surprising upset was suddenly viewed through a lens of suspicion. Fan trust, the most valuable currency any sport possesses, was eroding rapidly. Attendance, already fragile, began to drop even further. Why pay to see a game if the outcome was predetermined in a smoke-filled back room? Sponsors became wary of associating their brands with a sport that was gaining a reputation for being fixed. Teams folded not just because of financial instability, but because their credibility had been destroyed. The league seemed powerless to stop it. They lacked the resources and the authority to properly investigate and police their own players. The war for survival was no longer just about competing leagues or financial solvency. It was now a fight for basketball's very soul. The game was teetering on a precipice, its reputation in tatters, its future shrouded in doubt. The war on the battlefield was over, but the fight for basketball's soul had just begun. If the corruption off the court wasn't enough to kill the sport, the sheer brutality on it just might have. Professional basketball in the 1940s was less a game of skill and finesse, and more a form of organized violence. It was a street fight with a scoreboard. The game was played at a snail's pace. Without a shot clock, teams that got an early lead would often resort to stalling, holding the ball for minutes at a time. This led to long, agonizing stretches of inaction which only made tempers flare. The defending team, frustrated and bored, would resort to increasingly physical tactics to try and get the ball back. Elbows, hip checks, shoves, and outright punches were not just common. They were an accepted part of the game. Referees, who were often underpaid and poorly trained, quickly lost control. It was a two-man officiating crew trying to manage 10 increasingly hostile players in a game that was becoming more of a brawl. Players were ejected constantly. Fights were a regular occurrence, not just between players, but between players and fans. Spectators sitting courtside would heckle, grab, and even throw things at opposing players, and it wasn't uncommon for a player to charge into the stands to confront a fan. Some teams built their entire identity around this style of aggressive, dirty play. The Fort Wayne Zollner Pistons, coached by the fiery Carl Bennett, were notorious for it. They were the bullies of the NBL, a team that would physically intimidate their opponents into submission. They played a bruising, punishing style of basketball that often crossed the line into outright assault. They won championships, but they also earned a reputation as the most hated team in the league. The environment was toxic. Multiple referees quit mid-season, citing the constant abuse from players and the threat of violence from fans. The game wasn't just hard to watch, it was dangerous to play and officiate. It lacked the flow, grace, and athleticism that we associate with modern basketball. It was a slow, grinding, and often ugly spectacle that struggled to attract new fans. The league offices tried to crack down, instituting new rules and higher fines for fighting, but it did little to change the culture. The violence was a symptom of a larger problem, a sport without a strong central authority, filled with desperate men playing for low stakes in a high-tension environment. In the 1940s, a basketball game wasn't a show. It was a street fight with a scoreboard. By 1949, the war between the leagues had reached its breaking point. Both the upstart BAA and the veteran NBL were bleeding money. The BAA had the big city arenas and the media attention, but a weak on-court product. The NBL had the superior talent, including the game's first true superstar, George Mikan of the Minneapolis Lakers, but was stuck in small, dying markets. Both leagues were financially collapsing under the weight of their rivalry. They were driving each other into the ground. Faced with mutual destruction, the two sides did the only sensible thing they could. They called a truce. On August 3, 1949, representatives from both leagues met in the BAA offices at the Empire State Building in New York. After a tense negotiation, they agreed to merge. The best teams from the NBL, including McCann's Lakers, the Rochester Royals, and the Fort Wayne Pistons, would join the existing BAA franchises. This new unified entity would be called the National Basketball Association, the NBA. On paper, it looked like a monumental achievement. For the first time, almost all of the best professional basketball talent was under one roof. But the reality of the early NBA was far from glorious. The new league was a bloated, unwieldy confederation of 17 teams, scattered across the country in a bizarre mix of major metropolises and tiny towns. Alongside the New York Knicks and Boston Celtics were teams from Anderson, Indiana, Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and Waterloo, Iowa. The league was a logistical and financial nightmare. The small-town NBL teams couldn't compete with the big city BAA teams in terms of resources or revenue. The talent disparity between the top and bottom of the league was immense. The first season was chaotic. Teams folded before the year was over. The Anderson Packers, Sheboygan Redskins, and Waterloo Hawks would last only one season in the NBA before dropping out. By the second season, the league had shrunk from 17 teams to just 11. But despite the initial chaos, the merger was the single most important event in the history of professional basketball. It created a unified structure. For the first time, there was a single champion to crown. The NBA could finally begin to standardize rules, player contracts, and schedules. It brought the best of both worlds under one banner. The NBL's established talent and basketball history, combined with the BAA's big city exposure and marketing savvy. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't stable, but it was something. For the first time, basketball had a real league, one that would eventually conquer the world. The birth of the NBA wasn't a triumphant coronation, it was a desperate act of survival. The 1940s were basketball's trial by fire. It was a decade of chaos and collapse, a period where the very survival of the professional game was in question every single day. The sport was fractured by competing leagues, hollowed out by war, corrupted by gamblers, stained by racism, and defined by on-court violence. By any logical measure, it should have failed. But it didn't. Without that decade, without the chaos, the greed, the racism, the violence, the NBA never becomes what it is today. The sport had to hit rock bottom. It had to collapse before it could be rebuilt. The desperation of the 1940s forced innovation. The slow, brutal pace of the game led directly to the creation of the 24-second shot clock in the following decade, an invention that saved the sport and unlocked its offensive potential. The financial instability and the war between the leagues forced the merger that created the NBA, providing the unified structure necessary for growth. The undeniable talent of the segregated black teams forced the league to integrate, enriching the game with a new level of athleticism and skill that would propel it to new heights. Every flaw of that dark decade became a catalyst for change. Every crisis forced a solution that made the game stronger, faster, more entertaining, and more equitable. The NBA wasn't born fully formed. It was forged in the wreckage of the 1940s. Today we see packed arenas, global superstars, and billion-dollar television deals. We see a game celebrated for its beauty, its athleticism, and its artistry. But that glistening modern product owes its existence to a grimy, forgotten past. The NBA was born from the ruins of the 1940s, a decade that nearly killed basketball, but instead forged it. Every packed arena, every highlight reel, every buzzer beater owes something to the decade that almost ended it all. The NBA wasn't born from glory, it crawled out of chaos. Before basketball became beautiful, it was broken. And from that brokenness, it found its soul.